As of yesterday, every state in the country has eased restrictions on stay-at-home orders put in place due to the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of attention and money are focused on testing, tracing, and a vaccine. Some people are asking why more is not being done to find an antiviral medication to treat those suffering from COVID-19. Two of those people are here to talk about it, James Cole and Sam Brauer. Jim and Sam, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite.
Glad to have you. Everyone says follow the science. You're both scientists. You work in the area of antiviral drugs. So let's talk about the science. Sam, I know you have extensive consulting experience with antiviral pharmaceutical companies, and now you're in the process of trying to get the state of Connecticut to put more attention and resources into antiviral development. So why all this focus on vaccines and comparatively less on antivirals to treat those who are already sick?
And we're beginning with a question that's not exactly science. And it involves a lot of speculation on my part, because we're discussing we're discussing people's motivations as to why one versus another. But what I want to begin with is, from a scientist's perspective, it's both technologies are potentially quite valuable in stemming the tide of this epidemic, or pandemic, if you will. Why there's been more attention focused on vaccines versus antivirals, it may have to do with that there's been a lot of development work or new development work that's gone on in vaccines. That a lot of the technology of vaccines is actually coming out of developments in cancer. That cancer is a disease of the immune system. So there's been some new developments in vaccines, ranging from new adjuvants to the idea of things like virus-like particles that are, quote, sexy. And so there's also a lot of development money that's come out of cancer, so that people are chasing the idea of using the immune system to defeat either cancer, or in this case, a virus.
Well, using your immune system to attack a virus, that kind of makes sense, because one of the big problems of the past, which nobody will worry about anymore, I don't think, is the overuse of antibiotics for things that are not infections. So you have people taking antibiotics for viruses, which of course does them no good whatsoever. Your immune system needs to kick in and stomp it out. So I get that part, but so do we just have a love of vaccines, that everybody wants a vaccine, and then we don't have a problem anymore? That's great, but that doesn't seem like a fast enough approach in this case.
I don't think it really should be an either or. I think Jim and I discussed this, and both of us come from the viewpoint of, why not do both? That they're separate tools, and they each have their uses, their strengths and weaknesses. From our perspective, vaccines or antivirals look like they could be developed faster than vaccines. And both will have a strong impact on curbing the spread of the disease. So why not antivirals?
Will they also, if we find an antiviral for this particular COVID-19, will that also be helpful for, say, some future other version of coronavirus that comes along?
If we focus on what are called the conserved proteins, in other words, the virus mutates, and some of the proteins change, but not all of them do. And those are termed the conserved proteins. If we focus on the conserved proteins, then an antiviral that works on this strain of the coronavirus should also work on, or is likely to work on, other strains of the coronavirus. Jim could probably expand on that better than I could.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point about coronavirus. Is right now we have to worry about coronavirus that is currently circulating. But we all know this is not the first time. We've had SARS and MERS before, and there will be other coronaviruses coming down the pike. And it is probably a very intelligent way to go after viruses such as to go after the proteins that don't change, the conserved proteins. That's also where Vaccine technology may be a little bit more difficult since they tend to be more strain specific. And to have this broad spectrum antiviral would be incredibly valuable, not only for now, but for the future.
And Jim, is that, if I understand correctly, that's part of the work you do at the University of Connecticut, right? Is developing drugs to activate the cellular pathways which combat viral infections and inhibit these types of viruses, correct? I mean, that is part of what you do, right?
Right, that's what I'm doing, but what I've been doing for a while is even before this pandemic hit us, was to recognize that we really, rather than developing one drug per bug, which is the old-fashioned approach, is to think about developing drugs that will have broad spectrum applicability. And so we've been doing that for several years, targeting the process that we have in our body that fights viral infection, and having a way essentially to ramp that up in a way that will be effective against multiple viruses. More recently, we've also taken the approach of looking at the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, and looking at what are the proteins in it that are the most important for replication and targeting those for drug development. Those also tend to be very conserved among all coronaviruses. So if we develop a drug against this virus, we will have a drug that functions against multiple coronaviruses.
Certainly a good thing. You know, multiple coronaviruses, we would love to have that, yes.
Yes, exactly.
And can I also talk a little bit about another technology?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. There's a company called Nanoviricides in Shelton that's developed antiviral technology for a number of viruses, including MERS and SARS. And their idea is that you take the binding site of where the virus attacks the cell, and you spoof that so that you produce lots of copies of that, and you flood that in the body so that the virus doesn't know where so the virus can't tell what's the spoof and what its actual target is. And in so doing, the virus basically, the virus is no longer able to replicate effectively. And that's another way to serve as an antiviral. So if a future coronavirus also uses this ACE2 site as this ACE2 binding site as a target, then the Nanoviricides antiviral should work against any new strains that also use that binding site.
And Jim, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there's another guy by the name of Francesco Stellace at the University of Lausanne that's also exploring this technology.
Okay, I was just going to say, Jim, how does that correlate with what you're working on and what you're doing?
I think that if you look at this virus, it is a big, complicated virus with many proteins and many potential points of attack. It makes sense to go after all these different steps in the replication of the virus if we want to develop effective drugs. What Sam was just talking about is the idea of how do you block the virus from attaching to a cell? And that's a target that many companies are probably interested in. There's many other steps when it replicates its genetic material, and other steps that are maybe more subtle, which is how it attempts to evade our immune system. It deploys various ways of getting around what would be our normal antiviral response. All of these are important, I think, and need to be attacked in the same way that we are attempting to develop vaccines to prevent the virus from infecting someone in the first place.
You guys have sort of touched on it, but I get the impression that finding antivirals that would work is a little bit faster than finding a vaccine that would prevent one of these viruses. Is that a true summation, or did I misunderstand that?
I think you got that exactly correct. That vaccine development takes a lot of time not only to come up with the initial vaccine because they're very complicated products, but also to ensure their safety. And you know, the timelines that have been brought out are very aggressive, and the concern would be that some of the corners that are being cut involve long-term safety of a vaccine. Antivirals are only in the body a short time, so you don't really have to worry about long-term consequences of an antiviral. Plus, as Jim pointed out, we know a whole host of the conserved proteins in coronaviruses from things like SARS and MERS. So there's already been work done to develop some potential antivirals for this virus.
Yeah,
so
yeah, I think Sam's exactly right. And in fact, it's a little bit sad. There was quite a bit of interest in the basic, in developing anti-SARS and anti-MERS drugs back in the early when these were prevalent, and that sort of dropped off when these infections were eradicated. And we have, though, a lot of basic science that we can build on from those early days from the related coronaviruses.
As we talk about treatment of the people who are sick now, what about these antivirals can help us to reduce contagion through less shedding, less people not being as contagious once they're on active antivirals? Is that something that's possible?
Certainly, if you have an effective drug that blocks viral replication in a person, they're not going to be actively shedding virus, and they're therefore not going to be infectious. So it's not something that would just benefit the individual who's taking the medication. It would benefit the community at large to have this. And I mean, it's also true that these drugs can be you can imagine using them in multiple settings. They could be used in a prophylactic sense, that is in patient populations that are at very high risk, first responders, nursing home residents. And that's been sort of the idea, for example, that has been floated with some of the anti-influenza drugs, with Tamiflu, as to be used in a prophylactic sense. That would be while we're waiting for what is an effective vaccine, this would be critical.
All right, am I missing something obvious here? Because from what the two of you are saying is antivirals are faster, and I'll call it easier to come up with, so we get them to people sooner. Not only do they help somebody who's already sick, but they could prevent them from spreading it to someone else. And in addition, if you have like nursing homes you mentioned, which have been a huge problem with the coronavirus pandemic, the nursing homes have been hit really hard. You can use them in that kind of an environment, as well as medical professionals who are, they're going to be exposed to something, and an antiviral potentially will prevent or help with other coronaviruses that we don't even know about yet. So that kind of leads me back to our original question. Why isn't everyone more focused on antivirals than they currently are? I mean, do you two have some sort of unique perspective here, or is this like a common philosophy or viewpoint in the scientific world, and somehow the governments are missing it and they're not putting enough attention on it? What am I missing here?
I think you've nailed the question. You've succinctly stated the question, or succinctly stated the problem, and you answered it as well, which is the scientists agree the governments are missing the point. And one way to view this is this pandemic has been unexpected, and you can think of our response as been a little panicky. And when you panic, you don't necessarily make good decisions. And I think that one of the decisions or one of the bad decisions that's been made is that we haven't focused or put enough effort into antivirals.
Yeah, it's been a fairly low priority in the pharmaceutical industry for many years. Anti-infective agents have not been very, very effectively researched or being developed. And so we're playing a catch-up game right now, I think. where the infrastructure for doing this work hasn't been maintained. And yeah, it's really important right now that we focus equally, if not, on developing effective drugs.
Can I talk a little bit about the companies that are engaged in this research?
My impression from the news side is that there are a lot of companies working on the problem, and in an unusual turn of events, they're working together where typically they're competing against each other. They seem to be kind of pulling together in this case to see if they can figure it out. So yeah, let's tell us what's going on at different places. Yeah.
In terms of antivirals, not vaccines, the company that's very well funded is Vir Biotechnologies out in California. And GSK, which is one of the 4 major hitters in vaccine development, made an investment of around $250 million in Vir Biotechnologies. So and Vir also had a lot of investor interest, and so they're very well capitalized, which is remarkable for a small biotech startup. But aside from that, most of the other companies around the world, there aren't many. There's a company called Piron in Vienna that's looking at protein drugs. I think that was repurposed from GSK. I think there is another company called Pharmathon in Portugal that's looking at natural products. But if you look at the clinicaltrials.gov website and look at the clinical trials that are in progress, globally there are about 1,100 clinical trials involving COVID-19, which is a very large number. In the U.S. alone, there are over 250 clinical trials of something for COVID-19. But in terms of antivirals, there are, I think, somewhere less than 24 clinical trials going on, and none of them involve a novel compound that was developed specifically for a coronavirus.
So meaning all of the clinical trials that are being done right now for antivirals, not vaccines, antivirals, are existing drugs that somebody's trying to repurpose.
Yes, that's correct.
And I know in chatting with you ahead of time that I got the impression that while they help, none of them are really solving the problem.
I think the reports out of China have been very clear that there were some pretty talented docs there that were desperate to try just about anything to relieve the suffering of their patients. And I think I think we should take their work, while it was not done rigorously. I think it certainly was done well enough to show that if there was some magic bullet, they would have found it. So in other words, we don't have anything that works well enough to solve the problem.
So Anne, if I wanted to ask, a question as well, when you're talking about the testing not being as rigorous, what is the method, or if briefly you can describe the scientific process that goes into making this happen, like the steps that have to occur to get us to a point where we're confident that a particular antiviral or one that's created is going to really work?
The steps that occur for COVID-19 are the same steps that would occur for any other drug. And the development process is that scientists do basic research. They come up with an idea of what's a target molecule, and it's a funnel. And it's a funnel that you're gonna start with a lot of compounds, and you're gonna winnow it down. But the better idea that you have in terms of what the target molecule you're chasing after. In other words, if you know the protein in the virus and you know the crystal structure of that protein, that gives you a much better idea than just saying, we'll try some natural product out of a tree and see if it works, which was actually what people did for decades, natural products chemistry. But once you have an idea of a target compound, then you go through a series of tests of, you want to see that the compound, or use animal testing. So you want to see if the compound's effective, but you also want to see if it's toxic. It's great if the compound works, but it's not so great if it kills you doing so. once you've done these a number of experiments, and an animal trial for a COVID-19 drug is going to cost about somewhere around $100,000, give or take. Once you've done a number of these experiments, you can bring the data to the FDA, and they'll say, they'll either approve or disapprove. But if they give you approval, then you can set up what's called a phase 1 clinical trial. And a phase 1 clinical trial is basically just safety, which is where the Moderna vaccine is at. So in other words, you give it to a relatively small number of people to see that it's tolerated reasonably. If it is, then you can go to the phase 2, which is to see if it's effective, at which point you want to look for volunteers that have the disease or theoretically are going to be exposed to it, and to see if it's effective, again on a small scale. And then you progress to a phase 3 trial, which is large numbers of people. And those trials are very expensive and can run into the billions, especially for a vaccine. I don't know what GSK spent on Shingrix, but I know that, which was a recent vaccine for shingles, but I know that those clinical trials involve tens of thousands of people. And I suspect that a clinical trial for a COVID-19 vaccine would also involve similar numbers of people. So those are going to be expensive clinical trials. An antiviral would be much less expensive to have a clinical trial because you wouldn't have to follow the people anywhere near the same amount of time. So,
is that again because the antiviral medication doesn't stay in your system so long? So even if there are, I'm going to say, mild side effects, they're probably going to clear your system because the medication is in and out, and once you're feeling better, it clears your system and you're back to before.
Yeah, it's similar to antibiotics. I mean, you go on antibiotics, often there can be nasty side effects, but you only have to do it for a week, so you put up with it and then you move on.
So you were describing the vaccine approval process with all the trials, the clinical trials, and I think every expert they've made it really clear, vaccine 12 to 18 months is your best bet. That's as fast as it's going to happen because probably of all those trials. So what about antiviral? You said it's cheaper. You don't have to track people as long. If there was one that people said, oh, we think this works, and now we want to test it, what would be the time frame for an antiviral, a new one, that not a repurposed one, but you found a new tree that works, and you create this new antiviral, and now we need to test it. How long between we've discovered it and we've tested it and yes, it works? What's the normal kind of time range for that?
There really isn't such a thing as a normal time range.
All right, so you need the crystal ball. Give me an idea. Okay.
But let's assume that it goes to the FDA says yes, we're going to fast track this, and people are on it. So if you look at what has to be done, and let's say we take a compound that someone's got something that they looked at for SARS and says, yeah, we should see if this is going to work for COVID-19. So we've got such a compound. The FDA is going to want to see those animal trials and cell culture studies, but those can be done relatively quickly. In other words, in weeks, and you don't have to. We're not talking even months for those for that kind of testing. Once you've got that, and you've convinced the FDA that you can proceed to a phase 1 trial, that process could be done in less than 6 months. Once you go into phase 1, again, the clinical trials are going to be fast because you give the person the compound, you want to see what's going to happen, they're going to clear it. And so again, we're talking a matter of weeks. So we're talking a clinical trial that could be done in maybe a month or so. This is a very aggressive timeline again, but it's a hell of a lot faster than a vaccine.
Well, and the FDA has been, I think, pretty open to fast tracking things that look like they might work because they understand that this is a pandemic. This was unexpected. The world is playing catch up. It's not one place. And I cut people a lot of slack for initial response, whether they tried drugs that they didn't know if they would work or did things, where they locked down states and parts of the country. Because yes, when it first started, from a news standpoint, again, there was all this talk. I think there was a belief that it could be contained and stopped. And once they realized, oh, that's that bag, that ship has sailed. No containment's going to happen. So then I get it. People overreacted. They tried everything they had in their bag of tricks. But what you're saying is for a brand new antiviral, it could be anywhere from weeks to 6 months versus a year to a year and a half. Is that a good summary? I mean, if I'm
it's
for a vaccine, that is the year to a year and a half. Yeah.
There's no way that you're going to go from having a target compound to having something on the shelf in weeks.
Okay. I misunderstood. Wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Clear that up for me.
But could we have something in 6 months? Yes.
Okay.
You know, that's an aggressive timeline, but could it happen? Yeah, it could.
There's also, I just wanted to bring up another issue, which is the idea that we have an effective vaccine doesn't mean that we're able to deliver it to the entire population of this country or worldwide in any reasonable way. There's real problems with the scale up of producing vaccines because they're much more complicated entities. They have to often be made in specialized bioreactors, and to get the capacity to produce these kind of things at a scale that is necessary is much more difficult than producing small molecules typically. So the scale-up issue will also be a huge problem when we deliver a vaccine to a large number of people.
Well, that kind of goes back to your either or situation that you're saying that even if we have a vaccine, it doesn't mean we don't need an antiviral. And if we have an antiviral, it doesn't mean we don't want a vaccine.
We certainly want a vaccine very desperately. This is something that we all are looking for. And at the same time, what do we do in the interim before we have it? What do we do to help first responders and people who are at high risk for contracting disease? We need antiviral drugs.
Because when we're talking about access, one of the things I know that Anne, you had talked about was the minority population is really suffering from this disease more than anybody. Of course, the elderly in nursing homes and other areas. But when you're looking at something like a vaccine, typically what happens initially is kind of the haves get it and the have-nots don't, unfortunately. They get it later. They get it once it gets to the community center. It goes back to what you were saying about the availability and the scalability. So do you think that the antiviral tends to be, first of all, it sounds like easier to get to everybody, but also what about expense? Is it a cheaper thing for somebody to take than to get a vaccine?
What I can tell you is that a small molecule, which is an antiviral, a typical antiviral drug that's not, a protein or an antibody, is a lot less expensive to manufacture. And how that plays into the access question is sort of not a scientific question, really. As you can imagine, it's much more of a market-driven question as well as a political question.
Well, because less expensive to make doesn't always mean less expensive to the consumer.
Exactly.
But there's something you've said that you said it, but I want to make sure people hear it, which is that even if we have a vaccine, between now and the time that vaccine is readily available to everyone or anyone who needs it, there's going to be a lot of people who are sick in between. And so the antiviral would not only be helpful for the people who are sick in between, but for some other coronavirus that crops up, some other, not a mutation, but like a slightly different virus like SARS versus COVID-19, the antiviral may be helpful for that, where the vaccine, am I getting it right here? The vaccine would be much more specific to this one COVID-19 version.
It's going to be a long, and
okay.
My understanding, and I'm much more of an antiviral guy as my range of expertise, I think that we're much more likely to be able to develop a broad spectrum type of a protection with a antiviral drug, and it is also much easier to distribute. And so we won't have that delay.
All right, so I'm going to be the devil's advocate here because everything you guys are saying, I get it. You're antiviral people. You know, like what's the downside? I don't see any downside for pushing harder for an antiviral. What am I missing? What's the downside here?
You've also got us. We're also puzzled by that too. We don't
Okay.
we don't see it. It's there should be plenty of resources to do both, and it's if we come up with a successful antiviral, I don't see a downside. What would be the problem?
It's not gonna go to waste.
Nope.
If we have an antiviral.
Nope.
Oh my Lord, no. I mean, these will be compounds that, again, will presumably, by intelligently targeting these conserved proteins that are present on the virus, represent an insurance policy as more. I mean, there are going to be more coronaviruses that emerge from their animal hosts and infect people and potentially are really bad news.
I've even heard that some other people say that there's not only going to be other coronaviruses, but that there potentially could be somewhere 30% of the people who get sick die versus less than 3%, where the death rate is, astronomical. And I don't know if they were just being panicked about it, but people who sounded like they were in the know were saying, there are other strains or other versions which will be so deadly that it will be a completely different situation than what we're dealing with now.
I think the death rates that were just cited are probably out of either MERS or SARS, which had much higher death rates than COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So that's not fantasy. That's something that we should all be concerned about. In other words, this particular strain of a coronavirus is really not all that deadly. The next one could be a lot worse.
Right. For many people, this one is inconvenient and unpleasant, and then they get better and they move on. Obviously, it's been deadly for many people, and I'm not trying to downplay that, but compared to how many people are sick, the vast majority, it's extremely unpleasant, and they get better. And then, of course, there's the handful where everybody keeps talking about the asymptomatic, or where, they didn't feel well, they didn't even know they had it, that kind of thing. So the $6 million question here, or maybe it's the $60 billion question, what has to happen to get a little more attention, a little more focus, a little more money, resources, whatever it is, aimed at antivirals so that we can pick up the pace on those, not to put vaccines in the back seat, but just to bring the antivirals into action a little bit more.
And I think this now gets into a political challenge. It's the pharma companies will only develop products if they think there's a market. And antivirals have traditionally not been a large part of their business. And just some round numbers, antivirals last year represented about, call it $50 billion in sales globally. And this is out of a pharma industry that does about 1.2 trillion globally. So you're talking less than 5%. So really, antivirals are not a hot topic for pharmaceutical companies, which means that there needs to be a customer, and that customer is typically a government. So my suggestion would be, if someone's listening to this podcast and they think we're making sense, it's like, call your elected representatives and suggest, please, can we put more effort into developing antivirals? Because there are a lot of scientists who are sitting on the sidelines that would love to be working on this, but there needs to be support, or financial support, as well as bench space and a lot of other things. But the grants that have been out there to date aren't sufficient to really mount a real sustained effort, or aren't sufficient to mount a sustained effort to develop a novel antiviral. They're just too small.
So if this needs to be government driven, because government is going to be the big client here, I know you're not going to have the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why is the White House Coronavirus Task Force, the government agency, why aren't they talking more about antivirals if they are the big client and they're the ones who need it?
Anne, I think this is a question beyond my pay grade.
Okay. I knew you didn't have the answer, but I had to ask.
You tried, Anne. You tried. We'll give you that.
So
I think we have to get into somebody's ear, and I think the suggestion of writing to your congressman or just even talking about it, getting it out there. I like the idea of even doing things on social media and asking questions, because a lot of times, believe it or not, that's what they're looking at. They're not really even talking to scientists as much as they're like, what is my constituency asking for? So if we start saying, hey, why aren't you doing this? Who knows? We can start a movement. You never know. But I do think the question needs to be asked and asked and asked until somebody can come up with a better answer than, money. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this has to do with money.
Right. So Jim and Sam, would you suggest that people go to their state representatives or their U.S. representative? Like what level? No, but I'm gonna say, what level should they be talking to elected officials, saying, "Hey, who's looking at antivirals?" I mean, what level do they start asking these questions? I can't just ring up the White House and say, "Hey, why aren't you doing antivirals?"
Tweet. All you have to do is tweet.
Tweet. Oh, there we go.
I think this is an issue that's important enough that, and I believe Sam would probably echo me on this, that you should really be going at all. I think this is at both state and national levels, because states have had fairly significant investments in health related issues, and we can talk about that. But it's ultimately, it is a national issue as well. So our elected representatives at both levels, I think, are important people to contact.
So just go at all of them. Just start asking everybody, what are you doing about antivirals?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else we need to cover? We've covered a lot. We don't have answers to the really important questions. That's what's missing. So Sam, Jim, anything else that we need to let people know about here?
And I think you've done a good job of bringing out what the problem is. In other words, antivirals right now seem to be the orphan stepchildren that have been left behind. And if we can raise awareness of this fact, and I don't think there's any real disagreement that's what's going on, then perhaps we can solve this crisis a bit sooner.
I think an antiviral might make people feel comfortable if it's in conjunction with a vaccine, because then they feel like, well, when the next one happens, it won't be this same kind of panic response. We might have something to work with right at the beginning, or am I being a little too optimistic there?
The last time we had a major pandemic was in 1918. We've become very complacent about infectious disease, thinking that the docs will just give us a pill or we'll take a vaccine and we'll be fine. I think this whole experience has been a big wake-up call, probably to us all, Anne, right? We had an alert when MERS and SARS hit, and we didn't take it seriously. So, it's easy to let the funding fall away when no one's getting sick. I'm hoping that we maintain a much more vigilant stance in the future.
Life's lessons will be repeated until learned. So maybe we didn't get the message with SARS and MERS. Hopefully we get it with COVID-19 and we don't get so far behind the 8 ball.
We were really lucky with those diseases, incredibly lucky. Not quite so lucky this time.
Okay. All right, guys, thank you. I appreciate it, all the good information, and hopefully people will take your advice and start contacting their local representatives and the state, local, national, whatever it takes, if they think that we need to put a little more time, money, and effort into antivirals.